On the morning of October 25, 1944, off the coast of Samar, sailors aboard a small group of American escort carriers watched massive columns of water erupt around their ships. As the morning mist cleared, the terrifying silhouettes of Japan's heaviest battleships and cruisers emerged on the horizon. Leading them was the Yamato, armed with the largest naval guns ever built. The American vessels were slow, unarmored, and built strictly to support beach landings. They were suddenly trapped under the guns of the ultimate surface fleet. By every law of naval warfare, this small force should have been vaporized in minutes. But what happened next shattered every conventional scenario. This is not a story of miraculous luck or divine intervention. It is the story of a psychological collapse inside a vastly superior force, a catastrophic failure of perception, where reality on the battlefield was warped by the aggressive actions of a desperate enemy. It raises a profound question about naval combat. What exactly happens when the weakest ships in a fleet, rather than turning away in a frantic attempt to survive, abruptly steered directly into the teeth of an overwhelming armada? When the tiny, unarmored destroyers and destroyer escorts guarding the slow carriers realized the sheer scale of the danger bearing down on them, their mathematical chances of survival dropped to zero. A single, armor-piercing shell from the Yamato weighed as much as a small car, capable of passing entirely through a destroyer before detonating. By every tactical manual, a suicide charge by such fragile vessels against heavy cruisers and battleships should have resulted in their immediate destruction. Yet they did not vanish instantly. The paradox of the battle off Samar lies precisely in this impossible survival. To understand how a handful of ships could bend the rules of naval engagement to the breaking point, and how their seemingly suicidal defiance manipulated the minds of the men commanding the massive guns trained upon them, one must first look across the water. It is essential to understand exactly who was standing on the bridge of the Yamato, the intense pressure that commander was under, and the deeply ingrained expectations that drove the Japanese fleet to crave this specific encounter above all others. To understand the man commanding the Yamato, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, and the intense psychological pressure shaping his decisions, you have to look at the harrowing gauntlet his center force had just survived. For the previous 24 hours, the Japanese fleet had not been the hunter, it had been the prey. As they transited the Sibuyan Sea on October 24th, Kurita's ships were subjected to relentless, punishing airstrikes from American fleet carriers. The attacks were so ferocious, so overwhelming in their violence, that they accomplished something the Japanese Navy had considered almost impossible. They battered the super battleship Musashi, Yamato's heavily armored sister ship, and a symbol of imperial prestige, until she capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 sailors down with her. The loss was a staggering psychological blow. Under the weight of these continuous airstrikes, Kurita had temporarily ordered his fleet to turn back. But as night fell and the American aircraft returned to their distant carriers, Kurita reversed course once again, operating under absolute, desperate orders from Tokyo to disrupt the American liberation of the Philippines at any cost. He pushed his surviving battleships and heavy cruisers through the narrow, treacherous waters of the San Bernardino Strait. It was a perilous night navigation, but they emerged on the eastern side of the Philippine archipelago completely undetected. When the sun began to rise on the morning of October 25th, Kurita believed the worst was behind him. The primary American fleet, lured away by a separate Japanese decoy force, was gone. The path to the Leyte Gulf invasion beaches, where hundreds of vulnerable American transport ships were currently unloading infantry and supplies, appeared wide open. Kurita was exhausted, commanding a battered but still overwhelmingly powerful surface force, and he was mentally prepared to inflict absolute slaughter on a defenseless landing fleet. What lay directly in his path, however, was not the massive amphibious armada he was looking for, nor was it the heavy American strike fleet. It was a small radio call sign designated Task Unit 77.4.3, universally known to history as Taffy 3. Commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, Taffy 3 was the absolute antithesis of a naval strike force. Its core consisted of 6 escort carriers. These were not the massive, fast, heavily armored Essex-class fleet carriers that form the offensive spine of the United States Navy. Escort carriers, often affectionately and derisively referred to as jeep carriers or Kaiser coffins, were essentially commercially designed merchant ship hulls with a flat wooden flight deck hastily welded onto the top. They were built for rapid mass production, not for survivability in a gunnery duel. Their physical vulnerabilities were absolute. They were incredibly slow, maxing out at a sluggish 18 knots, meaning they could never outrun a heavy cruiser or a battleship capable of moving at 30 knots. They possessed virtually zero armor plating. Their hulls were mere fractions of an inch of unhardened steel. Inside those thin skins, they were floating tinderboxes, packed with thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel and magazines full of high explosives. Standard naval doctrine recognized that if an escort carrier was ever forced into a direct surface engagement with heavily armed warships, it was effectively doomed. Their only real defense was supposed to be distance and obscurity. Furthermore, the aircraft aboard these 6 small ships were tailored for a very specific utilitarian mission profile. They were meant to fly anti-submarine patrols to protect logistics convoys and to provide close air support for the Marines and infantry fighting in the mud of Leyte. On this specific morning, as the sun came up, the flight deck crews were preparing the first sorties of the day. In the magazines below, ordnance handlers were pulling out high-explosive fragmentation bombs meant for destroying Japanese troop concentrations. They were loading small-caliber rockets designed to strike concrete pillboxes, and they were arming depth charges specifically fused to detonate underwater against submarines. They did not have stockpiles of heavy, hardened, armor-piercing bombs designed to crack the thick steel decks of a battleship. They did not have squadrons of planes sitting on the flight decks, preloaded with anti-ship aerial torpedoes, ready for a fleet engagement. Taffy 3 was a strictly tactical support unit. They were designed to look down at the dirt and into the water, armed with weapons that would do little more than scorch the paint on a heavy cruiser. Protecting these 6 incredibly vulnerable carriers was a thin screen of just 3 destroyers and 4 even smaller destroyer escorts, vessels designed to hunt submarines and provide anti-aircraft fire, not to trade broadsides with the heaviest naval artillery ever cast. When the boxy silhouettes of these American ships first appeared in the massive optical rangefinders of the Japanese fleet, a catastrophic misinterpretation occurred on the bridge of the Yamato. Admiral Kurita peered through the morning mist and the scattered rain squalls, desperately trying to identify the enemy force that had suddenly appeared on his horizon. The Japanese lookouts, staring through high-powered binoculars, shouted out their identifications. They saw the flat tops of aircraft carriers. They saw the masts of the screening vessels. For a commander who had spent the entire war obsessing over the threat of the fast American carrier task forces, and who had been brutally bombed by them just hours earlier, the visual data simply confirmed his deepest expectation. He had been hunting for the main American fleet, and now his exhausted mind told him he had found a piece of it. Kurita immediately concluded that the slow, merchant-hulled escort carriers were in fact full-sized Essex-class fleet carriers. He looked at the tiny, unarmored destroyers and destroyer escorts and misidentified them as American heavy cruisers and larger fleet destroyers. The vast scale of the ocean, the lack of immediate reference points, and the distortion of the morning atmosphere certainly played a role in this error. But the primary mechanism was purely psychological. Kurita saw what he expected to see and what he feared. He believed he had caught a major component of American naval power completely by surprise. Operating on this entirely flawed assumption, Kurita issued the order for general attack. This was a command that dissolved his fleet's rigid, organized defensive formation and authorized his battleship and cruiser captains to aggressively run down the enemy independently. He unleashed a massive, overwhelming wave of destructive power against a target that had absolutely no business surviving the next 10 minutes. This was the supreme irony that defined the morning of October 25th. The most powerful surface fleet in the world, armed with 18-inch and 14-inch naval rifles, was bearing down on a collection of unarmored merchant hulls and anti-submarine escorts. Yet, the Japanese commander issuing the orders was operating under the absolute conviction that he was locked in a battle of equals. He was bracing for a clash of titans, expecting the Americans to behave like a heavyweight fleet. This fundamental error in perception, the unshakable belief that he was fighting a heavily armed, highly capable force, became a massive cognitive vulnerability. And that exact psychological vulnerability began to work directly against Admiral Kurita in the very second that a single, tiny American destroyer out on the edge of the formation made a completely illogical decision. As geysers of brightly dyed water, used by the Japanese gunners to track their artillery spotting, erupted around the escort carriers, the reality of the situation was absolute. Taffy 3 was caught in a lethal trap. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague immediately ordered his 6 slow carriers to turn their sterns to the enemy and flee toward a nearby rain squall, laying down thick, choking curtains of chemical smoke. On the flight decks, the scene was one of frantic, organized desperation. The crews didn't waste precious minutes switching out the ground support ordnance. They catapulted Grumman Avengers and Wildcat fighters into the air, armed with whatever they already held: depth charges, fragmentation bombs, and small rockets. The pilots were ordered to attack the Japanese fleet immediately. Their objective wasn't to sink the armored battleships. It was to harass them, to force the Japanese anti-aircraft gunners to look up, and to disrupt the enemy's focus. But smoke and aircraft alone could not bend the laws of physics. The escort carriers were straining their engines to make barely 18 knots. Behind them, Japanese heavy cruisers were slicing through the water at 30 knots, rapidly closing the distance. Retreat alone would only delay the inevitable by a matter of minutes. Someone had to physically step between the carriers and the Japanese guns to buy time. On the outer edge of the American formation, the destroyer USS Johnston was already turning. Commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, the Johnston did not wait for an order. Without hesitation, Evans broke away from the fleeing carriers, ordered flank speed, and steered his unarmored ship directly into the teeth of the Japanese armada. To a naval tactician, this lone charge defied all logic. The Johnston was a tin can, displacing just over 2,000 tons. Its main battery consisted of 5-inch guns, weapons whose explosive shells would literally bounce off the thick steel belt armor of a heavy cruiser or a battleship like the Yamato. In a pure artillery duel, the destroyer was irrelevant. But Evans wasn't charging to win a gunnery duel. He was charging to get into torpedo range. The mechanics of this desperate tactic hinged entirely on how heavy warships are forced to react to underwater threats. A battleship's armor can deflect shells, but a torpedo strike below the waterline is universally lethal. Therefore, a torpedo in the water demands an immediate, drastic response. If a destroyer can get close enough to launch a spread of torpedoes, the enemy battleship is absolutely forced to take evasive action. This is the critical mechanism of the charge. When a massive warship throws its rudder hard over to dodge a torpedo wake, the entire ship heels. The heavy gun turrets swing off target. The intricate mechanical fire control computers, which rely on a steady course and speed to calculate the complex geometry of hitting a moving target miles away, are instantly scrambled. By forcing the Japanese ships to maneuver, the Johnston was forcing them to stop shooting accurately. Evans was trading his ship for the most valuable currency on the battlefield, time. Every degree a Japanese cruiser turned to comb a torpedo wake, every minute it spent resetting its firing solutions, was a minute the slow American carriers used to crawl further toward the horizon. The solitary charge of the USS Johnston was a moment of sheer, calculated madness, but it perfectly established the tactical template for the entire morning. It proved that extreme aggression could weaponize the enemy's own survival instincts, a template that would soon be adopted by the rest of the escorts, transforming Kurita's organized pursuit into a chaotic, fragmented scramble. The tactical template established by the solitary charge of the USS Johnston was instantly recognized by the other screening vessels of Taffy 3. They did not need a coordinated fleet broadcast or a complex tactical briefing to understand the brutal mathematics of their situation. If the escort carriers were to survive, the Japanese heavy cruisers and battleships had to be forced to maneuver, and the only way to force a warship of that immense scale to alter its course was to put torpedoes in the water. Following the Johnston's wake, the destroyers USS Hoel and USS Heermann broke from the carrier formation and aggressively turned their bows directly toward the overwhelming Japanese center force. Behind them, an even smaller ship made the exact same calculation. The USS Samuel B. Roberts was not even a fleet destroyer. It was a destroyer escort. It was barely 300 feet long, armed with only 2 single 5-inch guns and a mere 3 torpedo tubes. Its engines were designed to push the ship at 24 knots, making it significantly slower than the Japanese heavy cruisers it was now turning to face. The commanding officer of the Samuel B. Roberts, Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, announced to his crew over the ship's public address system that they were entering a fight against overwhelming odds, from which survival could not be expected, but that they would do what was expected of them. The engineers in the boiler rooms tied down the safety valves, deliberately pushing the ship's power plant far beyond its red line design limits, wringing out 28 knots of speed as the tiny vessel hurled itself toward the Japanese line. What followed was not a traditional naval surface action, but a cycle of decentralized, frantic aggression that systematically dismantled the cohesion of the Japanese fleet. The mechanism of this disruption was highly specific. An American destroyer would sprint out of the gloom, instantly drawing the fire of multiple Japanese heavy cruisers and battleships. The water around the charging American ships boiled with near misses from 14-inch and 8-inch armor-piercing shells, creating columns of water that dwarfed the destroyers themselves. The American commanders held their fire, waiting until the range dropped to an agonizingly close 10,000 yards, then 8,000, and sometimes as close as 4,000 yards, point-blank range for heavy naval artillery. Only then would they launch their spread of Mark 15 torpedoes. The physical release of the torpedoes fundamentally changed the geometry of the battlefield. The Japanese vanguard consisted of heavy cruisers like the Kumano and the Suzuya, massive predators designed to hunt down and destroy smaller ships. But the moment a spread of torpedo wakes was spotted in the water, their offensive mission was instantly overridden by the absolute imperative of survival. A heavy cruiser traveling at 30 knots possesses immense momentum. It takes miles of ocean to execute a hard turn. When the Japanese captains threw their rudders hard over to comb the torpedo wakes, turning parallel to the incoming weapons to present a smaller profile, the consequences rippled through their entire formation. As a massive warship violently heels into an evasive turn, its heavy gun turrets are physically swung off their targets. The intricate optical and mechanical fire control computers deep within the ship, which rely on a steady course and speed to calculate the complex trajectories required to hit a moving target miles away, are instantly scrambled. The firing solutions are lost. The Japanese heavy cruisers were forced to stop shooting at the vulnerable escort carriers and spend precious minutes turning away, waiting for the torpedo threat to pass, and then slowly bringing their ships back onto a pursuit course. The organized, unified wall of steel that Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita had brought through the San Bernardino Strait began to fragment. The Japanese line stretched, broke into isolated segments, and lost its coordinated tactical focus. The tiny American destroyers were not necessarily sinking the Japanese leviathans, but by forcing them into constant evasive maneuvers, they were robbing them of their speed, their accuracy, and their forward momentum. Simultaneously, the environment itself was being weaponized. The American destroyers and the fleeing escort carriers were continuously generating massive volumes of chemical smoke. This was not merely a passive screen, it was an active, dynamic optical weapon. The battle space off Samar that morning was already complicated by low, dark clouds and sudden, intense, tropical rain squalls. As the dense, white chemical smoke mixed with the dark gray of the rain, it created an impenetrable visual barrier across the surface of the ocean. This had a devastating effect on Japanese targeting capabilities. Unlike the American Navy, which possessed highly advanced radar fire control systems capable of directing guns through darkness and weather, the Imperial Japanese Navy still relied heavily on optical rangefinders. The Yamato and the heavy cruisers were equipped with massive, incredibly precise optical stereoscopic rangefinders mounted high atop their pagoda masts. These instruments required clear lines of sight to manually track targets, measure distance, and calculate the fall of shot. The American smokescreens effectively blinded the Japanese fleet. A Japanese cruiser would manage to lock its massive optics onto an American carrier, calculate the range, and prepare to fire a devastating broadside. But before the guns could cycle and fire, the American ship would vanish entirely behind a dense wall of smoke. When the carrier emerged on the other side of the squall, several minutes later, it was on a different heading, traveling at a different speed. The entire grueling process of optical targeting had to start over from scratch. Furthermore, the smoke created a profound optical illusion. Because the American screening vessels were constantly darting in and out of the smoke to fire their guns and launch their torpedoes, Japanese spotters caught only fleeting glimpses of silhouettes. A destroyer would appear on the left, fire, and vanish. Moments later, another silhouette would emerge on the right. In the confusion of the battle, Japanese lookouts counted these fragmented sightings as separate ships, artificially multiplying the size of the American force in their minds. The smoke did not just hide Taffy 3, it magnified it, making the small unit appear as a vast, complex, and highly aggressive defensive screen. While the destroyers fought their brutal surface action below, an equally bizarre and desperate battle was unfolding in the sky. The 6 escort carriers of Taffy 3 were physically fleeing for their lives, taking incoming shell fire that shook their fragile hulls. Yet they simultaneously continued to execute complex flight operations. It was an absurdity of naval warfare. Flight deck crews were hauling aircraft onto catapults, fueling them, and launching them into the air, while massive columns of brightly dyed water from near misses cascaded across the wooden decks. The aircraft being hurled into the sky were Grumman TBF Avengers and F-4F Wildcats. Because they had been preparing for anti-submarine patrols and infantry support over Leyte, their magazines were stocked with the wrong weapons for a fleet engagement. Pilots took off carrying depth charges fused to explode underwater, small caliber rockets meant for concrete bunkers, and light fragmentation bombs designed to shred infantry, not steel. Against the incredibly thick deck armor of a Japanese battleship or heavy cruiser, these weapons were mathematically useless. A fragmentation bomb dropped on a heavy cruiser would explode violently, showering the upper decks with shrapnel, killing exposed anti-aircraft crews, shattering searchlights, and severing communication antennas. It created chaos and carnage on the superstructure, but it could not pierce the armored citadel or threaten the ship's vital engineering spaces. But just as the destroyers had realized that a torpedo didn't necessarily have to hit to be effective, the American pilots quickly realized that their ordnance was secondary to their behavior. Once a squadron of Avengers had dropped their inadequate bombs and fired their rockets, standard doctrine dictated that they return to their carriers to rearm, but there was nowhere to land. Their carriers were engulfed in smoke and actively dodging heavy artillery. So the pilots made a decision that fundamentally altered the psychology of the Japanese fleet. They did not fly away. Empty of all heavy weapons, the American aircraft continued to attack. They executed endless, aggressive, dry runs. A Wildcat fighter would peel out of the clouds and push into a steep, screaming dive directly toward the bridge of a Japanese battleship. The Japanese commander on the bridge, looking up through the armored glass, saw an enemy aircraft locked in a perfect attack profile. He had no way of knowing the plane's bomb racks were empty. Reacting to the visual threat of an impending bomb strike, the commander would order a violent evasive turn. The massive warship would heel over, its anti-aircraft batteries firing furiously into the sky, its main guns swinging wildly off their surface targets. The American pilot would pull up at the last possible second, having dropped absolutely nothing, while the Japanese warship spent the next 3 minutes completely off course, moving in the wrong direction, its firing solutions utterly destroyed. Multiply this individual action by dozens of aircraft swarming the sky above the Japanese fleet. The American pilots used their .50 caliber wing machine guns to strafe the armored bridges, their bullets bouncing harmlessly off the thick steel. But the sheer volume of incoming fire forced Japanese officers to duck behind blast doors and disrupted their ability to command their ships. The sky became a chaotic swirl of aggressive American aircraft, mimicking a massive, coordinated, heavy strike. The Japanese ships were constantly dodging ghosts, fighting a desperate anti-aircraft battle against planes that had already spent their ordnance. The pilots were buying seconds, and those seconds accumulated into minutes, physically slowing the Japanese advance. To understand the profound impact of this orchestrated chaos, the perspective must shift entirely to the armored bridge of the Yamato, to the mind of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. The battlefield is not an objective reality viewed from above. It is a mental construct built from the fragmented, confusing data available to a commander in the moment. Kurita did not possess an omniscient view of the ocean. He could not see that he was facing 6 slow, unarmored merchant hulls and a handful of light escorts. Instead, Kurita looked out from his flagship and saw a nightmare confirming his deepest anxieties. He saw a massive, impenetrable smokescreen stretching across the horizon, a tactic usually employed by a highly organized, professional fleet. Out of that smoke, aggressive, fast-moving warships were launching devastating torpedo attacks, forcing his vanguard cruisers to break formation and frantically maneuver for their lives. No commander in the Imperial Japanese Navy believed that tiny destroyers would charge a battleship formation alone. Therefore, the ships attacking his line must be heavy cruisers, supported by fleet destroyers. Above him, the sky was completely filled with enemy aircraft, diving relentlessly, dropping bombs, firing rockets, and strafing his decks. The sheer volume and relentless aggression of the air attacks mirrored exactly what his fleet had suffered the day before in the Sibuyan Sea. An escort carrier group simply did not possess that many aircraft, nor did it operate them with such coordinated ferocity. Therefore, the flat tops hiding in the smoke must be the massive, fast Essex-class fleet carriers he had been searching for. Every report Kurita received from his scattered vanguard cruisers confirmed this terrifying illusion. Enemy force includes heavy cruisers. Enemy carriers are launching massive strikes. Torpedoes in the water. Kurita was an experienced, hardened naval commander, but his perception had been hijacked by the sheer tactical audacity of the enemy. The cognitive trap was perfect. He believed he had stumbled into the main body of Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet. He believed he was engaged in a titanic struggle against a vastly superior, heavily armed American task force. The physical battle off Samar was violent and destructive, but the psychological battle had already been completely warped by the actions of Taffy 3. The fiercer the Americans fought, the more aggressively they charged, the more certain Kurita became that he was facing a massive, lethal threat. The American weakness had been perfectly cloaked in the aggressive behaviors of overwhelming strength. This bought time. The torpedoes, the chemical smoke, the relentless dry runs from empty aircraft. It had all forced the Japanese to fight a phantom fleet, delaying their advance by hours. But extreme aggression is a tactic, not a shield. The laws of physics, delayed by sheer audacity and optical illusion, could not be permanently suspended. As the morning wore on, the vast distances began to close. The smoke screens began to tear in the shifting winds. The Japanese gunners, despite the chaos and the evasive maneuvers, began to reset their mechanical computers and find their marks. The illusion was holding, but the physical reality of the battle was about to reassert itself with devastating consequences. The ships of Taffy 3, having traded everything for time, were about to start bleeding to death. The extraordinary tactical illusion created by Taffy 3 had held the Japanese center force at bay for hours, but it could not rewrite the basic mathematics of armor and ballistics. The Japanese vanguard was scattered and confused, but they were still moving at 30 knots, and they were still closing the distance. The bill for the time Taffy 3 had bought was coming due, and it was paid in steel and lives. The USS Johnston, having miraculously survived its initial torpedo run, found itself trapped deep inside the Japanese formation. Commander Evans, despite being severely wounded and forced to command his ship from the fantail through an open hatch, continued to direct fire against a line of Japanese destroyers attempting to close on the carriers. But a tiny tin can could only dodge 14-inch shells for so long. Successive direct hits systematically dismantled the destroyer. Power was lost. The main guns fell silent. As the Johnston lay dead in the water, Japanese destroyers closed to point-blank range, pouring fire into the sinking hulk before she finally rolled over and went down. Nearby, the USS Hoel was suffering a similarly brutal fate. After launching its torpedoes, the destroyer found itself boxed in by a Japanese battleship and heavy cruisers. The Hoel absorbed over 40 direct hits from heavy-caliber shells. It was physically blown apart, its superstructure reduced to twisted scrap, its engines destroyed, before it slipped beneath the surface. And the tiny destroyer escort, the Samuel B. Roberts, the ship that had pushed its engines beyond their red line to charge heavy cruisers, was finally cornered. A massive 14-inch shell from the battleship Congo tore through its thin hull, tearing a massive hole below the waterline and destroying its power plant. The ship, famously remembered as the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, sank rapidly. The screening vessels were dying, and with their destruction, the Japanese heavy cruisers finally broke through the smoke screens and achieved clear optical locks on the slow escort carriers. The unarmored merchant hulls began taking direct, punishing hits from 8-inch and 14-inch naval rifles. The USS Gambier Bay was repeatedly struck by heavy shells that ripped through its thin plating, flooding its engine rooms and setting massive fires, eventually becoming the only American aircraft carrier in the war to be sunk by naval surface gunfire. Other carriers were taking devastating hits, their flight decks pockmarked with craters, their interiors filling with smoke. Yet amid this physical destruction, an incredible, almost surreal operational tempo was maintained. Even as the escort carriers were being straddled by massive geysers of brightly dyed water, and even as heavy shells punched through their hulls, the crews on the flight decks continued to function. They were not abandoning ship, they were launching and recovering aircraft. Because their own flight decks were under fire, aircraft from the stricken carriers were instructed to land on other escort carriers further away, or to fly directly to the muddy, unfinished airstrip at Tacloban on Leyte. Planes were landing, hastily taking on whatever fuel and ammunition could be scavenged, and immediately launching back into the fight. This continuous, desperate operational capability cemented the fatal error in Vice Admiral Kurita's mind. He was looking through his optical rangefinders at a force that was absorbing heavy, direct naval gunfire. Yet those ships were simultaneously maintaining a relentless, aggressive tempo of flight operations under fire. In the rigid tactical doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Navy, only an elite, highly disciplined, heavy fleet carrier force could possibly sustain that level of operational activity while taking direct hits from battleships. The fact that the American carriers were still launching strikes while being ripped apart did not tell Kurita that they were desperate. It told him that they were formidable. The physical destruction of Taffy 3 was actively reinforcing the psychological illusion that was keeping the Japanese fleet off balance. But the illusion could only protect them for so long. The Japanese cruisers were now closing to within 5 miles. The American carriers were out of smoke. The surviving screening vessels were out of torpedoes. The aircraft were out of even light ammunition, reduced to throwing wrenches and firing sidearms out of their cockpits during dry runs. The distance had collapsed. The desperate tactics were exhausted. The moment of absolute physical annihilation for Taffy 3 had finally arrived. By 0911 that morning, the survivors of Taffy 3 were staring down the barrel of absolute destruction. The escort carriers St. Lo, Kalinin Bay, and Fanshawe Bay were all taking heavy, systematic fire. The Japanese heavy cruisers, Chikuma and Tone, had pushed through the remnants of the smoke and maneuvered into firing positions on the carriers' flanks, preparing to deliver the final killing broadsides. The Yamato and the remaining battleships were closing in to finish the slaughter. Aboard the American ships, sailors braced for the end. Men stood on listing decks, covered in oil and soot, watching the massive gun turrets of the Imperial Japanese Navy rotate and lock directly onto them. There were no more torpedoes. There was no more smoke. There was nowhere left to run. The battle had reached its mathematical conclusion. And then, across the Japanese fleet, a signal flag was hoisted. The blinking lights of signal lamps pierced the gloom. A completely unexpected, incomprehensible order was broadcast from the armored bridge of the Yamato. The order was, "Cease action. Come north with me." To the utter disbelief of the American sailors watching through their binoculars, the massive turrets of the Japanese heavy cruisers stopped tracking. The ships began to turn. One by one, the leviathans of the center force altered course, leaving the shattered, smoking remnants of Taffy 3 behind and steamed away toward the north. The annihilation was abruptly, inexplicably canceled. The strongest surface fleet in the world had retreated from an enemy that was minutes away from total destruction. This was not a tactical withdrawal to regroup. It was the abandonment of the entire objective. To understand this stunning reversal, you must look at the battlefield purely from the isolated perspective of Vice Admiral Kurita at that exact moment. He was not looking at the victory he was about to achieve. He was looking at the price his fleet was paying, and the massive, unseen threat he believed was closing in on him. He had lost 3 heavy cruisers, Chokai, Chikuma, and Suzuya, ships that were critical to his vanguard, disabled by the relentless air attacks and the frantic torpedo runs. His fleet was scattered across miles of ocean, completely disorganized after hours of dodging torpedo wakes and fighting phantom aircraft. Furthermore, The constant, unrelenting stream of American planes attacking his ships had convinced him that the main American carrier force was now launching its heavy strikes against him. He was receiving frantic, contradictory radio intercepts. He believed that if he continued to chase what he thought was Admiral Halsey's main fleet, he would drag his disorganized, battered center force deeper into a trap. He was tasked with destroying the invasion shipping at Leyte, but the aggressive defense of Taffy 3 had dragged him miles off course and consumed the critical morning hours. Kurita, exhausted, operating on severely flawed intelligence, and deeply affected by the loss of the Musashi the day before, calculated that the risk of total annihilation by a massive American carrier strike outweighed the tactical benefit of sinking a few more ships. The psychological operation had worked flawlessly. The illusion of overwhelming strength had broken his resolve. The tiny escort carriers and their shattered escorts watched the Japanese masts disappear over the horizon, asking the same question. How did a force so completely outmatched force an armada to turn away? The men of Taffy 3 had begun their morning staring at the massive silhouette of the Yamato, bracing for an execution that seemed mathematically certain. Now, mere hours later, they stood on their shattered, smoking decks and watched those same towering pagoda masts recede over the northern horizon. The American sailors had not sunk the Yamato. They had not annihilated the Japanese center force in a classic, decisive naval engagement. By the strict, calculating metrics of naval warfare, the escort carriers and their tiny screening vessels lacked the armor, the caliber, and the speed to win a surface duel against heavy cruisers and battleships. Yet they survived, and the Japanese fleet retreated. This impossible outcome was not the result of a miraculous accident. Taffy 3 survived because its ships and its pilots behaved exactly how the Imperial Japanese Navy believed a massive, lethal strike force would behave. Their survival proves a profound, terrifying truth about warfare. Commanders do not fight the objective reality of the physical battlefield. They fight the picture of the battlefield that exists inside their own minds. Admiral Kurita possessed overwhelming, undeniable firepower, but his decision-making was entirely captive to his flawed perception. He expected to find the massive, fast fleet carriers of the American Third Fleet, so the frantic, desperate flight operations of the slow jeep carriers looked to him like elite fleet carrier tactics. He feared an ambush by heavily armed American cruisers, so the suicidal torpedo charges of the unarmored destroyers convinced him he was facing exactly that. The Americans essentially weaponized their own desperation. Unable to rely on fixed steel plating or massive naval rifles, they took their absolute weakness and masked it in such unrelenting, chaotic aggression that it became completely indistinguishable from overwhelming strength. Every spread of torpedoes launched into the gloom, every dry run by a fighter plane with empty bomb racks, and every blinding wall of chemical smoke actively validated the terrifying picture taking shape inside Kurita's head. Taffy 3 did not break the Japanese center force with pure kinetic energy. They defeated a vastly superior armada by making the continuation of the battle seem unreasonably expensive, chaotic, and strategically disastrous. The tiny American unit proved that when absolute vulnerability is disguised as a mortal threat, it can shatter the resolve of pure firepower. They broke the enemy's perception long before the enemy could finish physically breaking them. The Yamato possessed the largest naval guns ever forged, and Admiral Kurita commanded a vastly superior, heavily armored fleet. Taffy 3 had neither. What it had was torpedoes, chemical smoke, empty aircraft, and ships willing to charge directly into the fire instead of disappearing. The Imperial Japanese Navy believed it had finally caught America's heavy carriers in a fatal trap. What it actually caught was a force mathematically too small to win and far too aggressive to ever behave like it knew that.